I'd like to welcome you all to our first meeting in 2015. Today I'm very pleased that we have two excellent speakers on pesticides and their impacts on people and pollinators. Before I introduce our speakers, I would just like to briefly describe the regulatory setting for pesticide control in California. Monterey County's Ag Commissioner was invited to participate in this meeting and was unable to participate because of family illness. The state of California is the primary regulating agency for pesticides, and the Department of Pesticide Regulation is not only helps with developing regulations, but also works with the legislature to address the issue. The primary responsibility for implementing these pesticide regulations rests at the county level with the County Agricultural Commissioner. And the County Agricultural Commissioner is appointed by the Board of Supervisors. So that gives you a broad overview of how pesticide regulation works in California. I will introduce both of our speakers, and Mark Weller will go first and Dale Hilliard will go next. Mark is a community organizer and staff member of Californians for Pesticide Regulations. He previously worked for 14 years as project director for Monterey-based Unite Here, Local 483, organizing community and political support for hospitality workers. Mark has a BA in political science from UC San Diego and a master's in sociology from San Jose State University. He is co-author of Dollars and Votes: How Business Campaign Contributions Subvert Democracy. Our second speaker is Dale Hilliard. He is a beekeeper and operates Hilliard hives and wasp removal and has done that since 1981. He specializes in non-pesticide removal and relocation, honey, pollination, and apitherapy. He is past president of Landwatch Monterey County and is an active member of Breathe California, spearheading the anti-smoking campaign here in Monterey County. So to begin with, why don't we have both speakers come to the table, and Mark will begin his presentation.
Okay, thank you, everybody. Yes, my name is Mark Weller, and I work for the Californians for Pesticide Reform, and I'm working out of the office of the Monterey-based Central Labor Council in Salinas. And great pleasure to be here. An amazing room of people. I think especially with 3 generations of Ericksons, I know I got to be on top of my game. This is terrific. And I haven't seen Darby in a while, so it was great to see her. And I was greeted by, Mark, you're bald. And indeed, there's no doubt about that. That's where I am now. Okay, so speech today is Mitt Romney, 2016 is the third time a charm, right? No. No. It's pesticide reform. I want to start with going back a bit. Now, I had first anticipated being on a panel with someone from the Ag Commissioner's office, and that didn't happen. So know that I'm coming from the reform side, that I really think that we do need significant reforms in pesticides. And it comes out of a long history. Cesar Chavez's last fast in 1987, his longest, 36 days, was about reducing pesticides. Right? And he said during that fast, in the old days, miners would carry birds with them to warn against poison gas. Hopefully the birds would die before the miners. Farm workers are society's canaries. Farm workers and their children demonstrate the effects of pesticide poisoning before anyone else. So this fight that the United Farm Workers were involved in for the last half century goes back coming out of an area where this is an actual ad from DuPont, better things for better living through chemistry, and we have, this says DDT is good for me. And we soon learned that that was not the case. Indeed, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, about 3 years ago now, her theory was, look, pesticides kill very small things, but the larger things that eat them, it can poison them too, and it goes up the food chain. And she created a prediction that if we kept going the way we were with pesticides like DDT, we would have a silent spring. And luckily, a number of people thought this theory had power, and we started to see experimental results showing that it did, and a reform movement grew. This is a sign, the first one in California, and it was in the fields in Monterey County. It came out of a movement for pesticide reform. In fact, our current state senator was working for California Rural Legal Assistance, who helped push this through an ordinance in Monterey County. This is from 1981. So in this area, too, we have had, I would argue, probably the biggest reform movement against pesticides in all the United States. In fact, in 2012, one of the things that pushed Arista out of the entire U.S. market for methyl iodide was a campaign centered in Monterey County and Santa Cruz County that got the Board of Supervisors to pass resolutions against that concerning pesticide. And it is still a central problem for us. This is the Nation magazine article from March of 2014. This was an article about the concerns about pesticides on the brain that was focused in the Salinas Valley. And this is, again, back to the theme of Cesar Chavez. Okay, so one of the things that we're finding out over these past 50 years is that children are the most vulnerable to pesticides. I mean, we all are. But because of their developing bodies and because, for instance, they breathe twice as much air up to the time they're 12 as adults, it just has a bigger effect on children, and including the American Academy of Pediatrics and the American Congress on Obstetricians and Gynecologists. They've done big reviews, and they've all recommended that we reduce hazardous pesticides, especially regarding children. And then last April, our own California Department of Public Health put out a unique study of pesticide use near public schools in California. Now, this is one of the things that I was scheduled to talk about, pesticide use near schools, as well as some of the latest air monitoring results. So some of this presentation will involve numbers and things, but stay with me. I hope to make a larger point that's clear. So this, again, is available online as well. And what we found out from this study is that 1 in 4 Monterey County school children go to schools within a quarter mile of highly hazardous pesticide applications. That is the highest percentage in the entire state of California. That's 18,500 students. And only Ventura County had more students that were close. And I put exposed in parentheses because pesticide use near schools doesn't necessarily mean the students have been exposed, but it is a concern, and I'll show you why with the air monitoring results in a minute. So the top 3 used pesticides in Monterey County, and many other counties that are agriculturally centered, are fumigants. And again, those are the most prone to drift. So they can drift away from the fields that they're applied. And those are chloropicrin, methyl bromide, and telone. It's actually known as 1,3-dichloropropene. The same report noted that Latino children are nearly twice as likely, 91% more likely as whites, to be near the highest volume of highly hazardous pesticide use. And in fact, a similar information to this was part of a lawsuit back in 1999 over methyl bromide. And I'll get back to that in a minute too. 3 of the top 7 California schools with the most pesticides were in Monterey County. Gavilan View Middle School, Pajaro Valley Middle School, and Bolson Knolls Middle School. Gavilan View and Bolson Knolls are both in the Santa Rita School District. Pajaro Middle, of course, is in the Pajaro Valley School District. And according to our agriculture commissioner, there is a 500-foot buffer zone in practice in Monterey County. And we learned from this report, with an index in the back, that 500-foot buffer zone is far shorter than at least 6 other counties, and actually more than that, in California. So I'm sorry, these are small, but I'll go over them quickly. The pesticides that are used near Monterey County schools, these are the top 10. And one of the things I want to point out is, of these pesticides, every single one of them, if not banned in some part in the United States by our own Environmental Protection Agency, are banned in other parts of the world. Banned outright. Chloropicrin is a chemical that was first developed and used in World War I. It was called the vomiting gas because it got inside gas masks, and then the soldiers would take off the gas masks and be poisoned or killed by the other lung-damaging gases that were in the battlefield. So when we were done with World War I, we had this stockpile of chloropicrin and figured, well, let's ship it to Hawaii and see how it works on pineapple pests. And it worked very well on pineapple pests, too. It's banned, I think, for almost 100 years in the battlefield, but can be applied in the agricultural fields next to schools. Our own Department of Pesticide Regulation calls that a toxic air contaminant and a fumigant, and it is banned by the European Union last year. Okay. Methyl bromide, the good news about methyl bromide is because of, again, about 15 to 20 years of battle, a lot of it in the Pajaro Valley area, by the way, methyl bromide is going to be done with after this year. Okay. Yes. Since 2005, it's supposed to have been banned by a Montreal Protocol worldwide, but there was a critical use exception. And 90% of that critical use exception is for strawberries, exactly. I heard somebody say strawberries. And so a lot of the methyl bromide that's used in the entire world is used in Monterey County and Santa Cruz County on strawberries. It is also a toxic air contaminant and can cause reproductive and developmental harm. And so we are glad it's going away. The problem, of course, is the substitutes. One is chloropicrin, and others are using 1,3-diethylchloropropene, better known as Telone. That's also a toxic air contaminant, and it's also a carcinogen, okay, banned by the European Union. And so those are the top three. They're major concerns, but also I want to point out that those pounds applied, this is an order of pounds applied, and it's not the greatest measure because some pesticides in very small amounts can cause huge amounts of damage, whereas others you can apply more. So this is just one way of categorizing pesticides. Now, the schools in our area with the most pesticide use within a quarter mile, you can see are in the Salinas and Pajaro Valley area. Galvin View Middle, Pajaro Middle, Bolsa Knolls Middle, Hall District Elementary, Oscar Loya Elementary, Alisal High, La Jolla Elementary, Ohlone Elementary, Everett Alvarez High, and Elkhorn Elementary. Okay? Those are the ones with the most pesticides by pounds applied in our area. One of them that was not on that list because, again, it's one of those pesticides, a very small amount can cause a huge amount of damage. A small vial of it wiped out all life in a river in Singapore a few years ago. Come out of the organophosphates, again, another war weapon, nerve gas, and it's called chlorpyrifos. Chlorpyrifos, it's an insecticide. It's used a lot in South County. We've found out it's especially dangerous for children. And in studies in the Salinas Valley of families there, the scientists out of UC Berkeley, in a study called the Chamaco study, have found that in close proximity to fields where chlorpyrifos is applied and where women are pregnant, that we see a higher incidence of lower IQs and behavioral problems. In fact, they found a 7-point IQ decrease than would be expected if they weren't close to chlorpyrifos. And then this year, maybe a more controversial study, but the study nevertheless out of UC Davis found that a 60% increase in autism if the pregnant woman was in a mile of chlorpyrifos use. So these are really concerning to us. And look, even the wild Chinese regulatory system is going to ban chlorpyrifos in 2016. We have just recently made chlorpyrifos a restricted pesticide, which means that you have to be licensed and trained to apply it. Okay. That's really basically the only difference. And reporting measures the standards are a little bit higher. Okay, so schools with the most chlorpyrifos use, Greenfield High and Vista Verde Middle, those are both in the Greenfield area. and then Barden Elementary at the LSL Union. You can see the pounds of pesticides is very low, but that Greenfield High is the 4th highest amount in the state for schools where chlorpyrifos is applied. Now, one of the things that Janet was talking about earlier was the regulatory process. And this school study compared the regulations in different counties in California. In Monterey County, and again, this largely comes from that table in the appendix of the book, it's 500 feet, as we said earlier. For fumigants, it's supposed to be a little bit longer because of the legal requirements of the labels. So it should be 1/8 of a mile up to 1/4 of a mile. And the Pajaro Valley and North Monterey County school districts have language in the union contracts for teachers that are supposed to require some reporting. And I've heard from both unions that the 5-day notice they think they're supposed to get, they're not getting. So there is kind of a battle over that reporting in those school districts. But we can see that Kern County, Stanislaus County, Ventura County, Tulare County, Yolo County, all, yes, big agricultural counties, but they have 1/4 mile buffer zones. That's 1,320 feet as opposed to 500 feet in Monterey County. And many of the others get reports from the Ag Commissioner's office to the schools. That's not happening in most of the Monterey County schools. Okay, so what we often hear, and again, farm workers can give you decades of experience about this, is people will report they're concerned about being sick after being near pesticides. They're concerned that their children aren't developing as expected, possibly because of their near to pesticides. This has been going on for a long time, these stories, but the pesticide companies will say, well, those are anecdotes, those are stories, and while they might be concerning, they're not scientific. So we need to do scientific studies. We need to know, what really is going on. Proximity to pesticide applications isn't enough. Well, there are now air monitoring studies. Those studies about chlorpyrifos that I mentioned earlier by the universities, those are biometric studies, actually using bodily fluids to test. But if you want to find out what's in the air, we have 6 air monitoring stations in all of California. 2 of them are in Monterey County. One of them is at the Salinas Airport. Yeah, you're laughing, right. Far away from any schools, actually more than 1/4 mile away from any fields. And then the Ohlone Elementary School. The one at Ohlone Elementary School is required by a civil rights lawsuit from 1999, Angelita C. versus State of California. Anyway, that lawsuit said that it was racially discriminatory the way that the Department of Pesticide Regulation regulated methyl bromide, because Latinos were far more likely to go to schools near methyl bromide applications than white children. Okay. Out of that, 12 years later, they said, okay, we're going to put an air monitoring site at Ohlone Elementary then to test for methyl bromide and other pesticides in the future. That was the end of the lawsuit, 12 years later. Okay, so 1,3-dichloropropene, or Telone, that's a carcinogen, Prop 65 chemical. We know from these air monitoring studies now that came out in September and October, I believe, that the EPA cancer risk concentration regulatory goal was exceeded at the Salinas Airport in 2011. Remember, Salinas Airport is more than 1/4 mile away from fields. Many of the schools are not. Okay. It was exceeded in 2012 at Ohlone Elementary. The level is 0.14 parts per billion. It was 0.16 at Ohlone Elementary School, and that's an average over the year. So the way they measure this is on a 6-day kind of rotating, randomly monitored basis. They register the levels. And there's some questions to how scientific that is, because most of this awful stuff is applied between August and the end of October. Right? And we're putting in other months where there's very little fumigants used. And so that tends to lower the average, of course. It's kind of like if you're pulled over by a cop who gives you the breathalyzer test and the standard's 0.08 and you're at 0.12, and the cop says, you're really drunk. I said, no, yesterday I didn't have a drink at all. I was 0 yesterday. So that's 0.06, so I'm below. And it doesn't work that way, for exposing to poisons. Anyway, so in comparison, though, that Ohlone Elementary, they had 935 pounds of this stuff applied, we know, in 2010. Now, it's a little bit off. It's 2012. But look, we know about how much is applied every year. At Gavilan View Middle and Bolson Middle, we had 5 to 6.7 times more applied within a quarter mile of those schools. And we had concerning limits at Ohlone Elementary. So these kind of numbers make us very concerned. And, we're trying to tell the Department of Pesticide Regulation, our ag commissioners, et cetera, that something needs to be done about this. A blockbuster report I hope you have time to look at. The Center for Investigative Reporting came out in November with a study about pesticide use, and they find that near New Republic Elementary in the Santa Rita School District, 1.3 million pounds more T-lone of this stuff was applied than would have been allowed under old 1990s regulations, okay, in about a 10-year period. Also, in those air monitoring studies, chloropicrin, remember that World War I lung-damaging agent, it exceeded the regulatory goals of the Salinas Airport by 40% in 2013, the last year that was studied. Okay? And also remember that Gavilan View Middle and Bolson Knolls Middle, within a quarter mile, had the second most and seventh most amount of this stuff applied near schools in the entire state of California. All right, so if it's bad at the Salinas Airport, which is more than a quarter mile from chloropicrin applications, it's probably awful at Gavilan View Middle and Bolson Middle is where our kids are going to school, to middle school. And we still haven't gotten results from Ohlone Elementary yet in Pajaro Valley. Okay, methyl bromide is not meeting the warning levels, but it has been increasing. And again, the good news is it's got to stop increasing because they can't use it after 2015. Those are the numbers. This is a photograph taken by a teacher back on November 12th. It's a little blurry. It's taken one of those bad, cell phone cameras. But this is a guy in a hazmat suit spraying. These are two completely unprotected farm workers. And this is a very short distance between the school parking lot and children. She said children were coming off the bus right about where I am. And yeah, what's going on there? We want to know. It's concerning. Maybe nothing. Maybe there's just some regulation that says no matter what you spray, you have to put a hazmat suit on. And we don't have to worry about everybody else. But it's to give you an idea of how close these fields are to the schools. So what we want, and I'm part of a reform group, is we want to push back the borders, the buffer zones so you can't see these guys, right? If you're at a school. We want to push way back, okay? And we also want to know, what are you spraying? When are you spraying? Okay. That can help inform us as to a policy we might make regarding schools and children and what we do about it. So back in June, 4 teachers' unions in our local area got together and came up with a list of demands that they sent to the Department of Pesticide Regulation and have been pushing ever since. One is larger buffer zones around schools. Because in 6 other counties it's a quarter mile, we said at least a quarter mile. We know we can do that. It's already done. We want 3-day notice. More would be great, right, of any applications near schools. Want an online public database of pesticide use near specific schools. Right now, the only information we can get regarding that is this Department of Public Health study with 2010 data. You can't replicate that right now unless you undergo, a graduate thesis, which requires, thousands of hours of work. We also want air monitoring done in a more comprehensive way than it is now. We want it done at many more sites than it is now, and we want to see an annual study comparing year to year. And we also want, ultimately, right, a transition to safe, sustainable fumigant and organophosphate alternatives. And we think a 2020 deadline is not unrealistic. There are a number of studies done, even at UC Santa Cruz, that are showing some really promising possibilities. And again, the stuff we're worried about here, all banned in Europe. Okay, we talked about the decision makers earlier, so I can skip that. And please, if this interests you in pushing back in kind of a more activist way, we have a Safe Strawberry Monterey County Working Group. Some of you in this room are in it. It meets the second Thursdays in 2015 of every month at 6:30 at the Central Labor Council office, which is on the corner of Sanborn and Market there in Salinas. And my contact information is here. I'd love a call, or if you want to email me, that's great too. And I can provide any background information that on which the slides were based to you or any group you might be a part of. So that is the presentation from this perspective, and the stuff I took out about bees and butterflies and that kind of thing, I'm going to leave to Dale.
We will take questions after Dale's presentation. So Dale, you're on first there.
Okay, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Any beekeepers in the audience? All right, you got one? When I was 9 years old. When you were 9 years old. And the normal question is, did you get stung? Sure. We beekeepers seem to have that ability to eventually get stung in this process, because that's one of the standard questions that I get asked. How many times? I lost count. But actually, it's one of the benefits. There's a book I was mentioning earlier about beekeepers don't get arthritis. Actually, the bee venom, once it's injected into the body by one single bee, that venom gets pumped into the body, and your body makes natural cortisone. So this is a hard presentation to follow. Because it really does strike home. And so I'm going to ask you to kind of think of your honeybee now. How do you live in that environment? You're big. The body's big. We seem to be able to tolerate a lot, and we've got a liver, and we've got a bunch of other organs that processes toxic things. So from a honeybee standpoint, and from our scientific standpoint, now we are able to analyze the stomach contents of a honeybee. Now, when I started with bees in 1981, it was easy. Made a lot of honey. It was fun. It was in my backyard. Neighbors liked it. Everything was pretty good. But now, the contents of the gut of a honeybee looks like a garbage dump. It's got a lot of toxic stuff in it. And where do they get that toxic stuff? Well, we humans do just what he was presenting. We spray it. So what's a buffer zone for a honeybee? There isn't one. Now, I made I started this in 81 and as a hobbyist, and now I've done a number of talks. My bee group, we set up a beehive at the Ag Building in the Monterey County Fair, and we set up an observation hive, worked with the Ag Department, and we're there for 6 days with an observation hive. That's a plug, so next time you're at the Monterey County Fair, stop by. I'm generally there, and you'll get to see what a queen bee looks like. The bees fly in and out of a hole we have in the wall, go out and do their thing, come back. And then when the exhibit's over, I take the bees home, put them back in my collection of honeybees. But getting back to, the bee is a pollinator. So when I have made presentations in the past, I usually just talk about honeybees. But now, well, let me just kind of go from that standpoint. Where are the bees? What happened to them? Do you still see bees in your backyard? And if you do, you're one of the lucky ones. Because at one time, there was a real decrease in the honeybees. even the honeybees that were living in our trees, in the oak tree, in the cavity in the oak tree, they were dying off. And I collected very few swarms. And that was a cycle, and it was brought on by a mite. Mites were brought over from Asia, and they have been distributed all over the United States now. So how did they get distributed? Well, once again, with what you see here with this toxic stuff that we apply that in the San Joaquin Valley. If you drive Highway 5, you'll see a bunch of white boxes along with the almonds. And now, I know we're involved with water, and we're pumping water out, and the water's toxic, it's got high minerals in it and all that kind of stuff. Well, as the almond industry got better and better, they needed more and more bees to pollinate the almond trees, because we don't have a self-pollinating almond tree yet. They're working on it in Davis, but so back when I had bees, I still have them, but not as many. It cost $25 a hive to pollinate the almonds. That's what a beekeeper would get to move his boxes over there and pollinate them. Now it's $200. Okay, supply and demand, economics. Well, what happened? Well, one of the things is when you bring about 80% of the bees in the United States to the almonds, because they need them, and the beekeeper needs the money, you put all the diseases that the bees are carrying, mites, other diseases, in one valley. So sarcastically, we call it the cesspool, and you bring all your bees from Florida and other states, and you bring them all to the same area, just like, why do we get the flu during the wintertime? Same thing with humans. You put them all together, we share our different kinds of bugs, and the mite was one of them. So the Asian mite came in, we imported them from other countries, we then bring our bees to one location, and they share the mites. The mite is like if you were holding a rabbit, in proportion to your body, that's what a mite would be if you were a honeybee. They're that big. And a mite has little suction cups on its body, and that's how it attaches itself to the honeybee. And the mite lives in the hive. It lays its eggs on the bee larva and hatches as that process goes on. So what do beekeepers do? They try to figure out a way to kill the mite. Well, here again, we're applying pesticides inside a beehive, not to kill the bees, but to kill the mites. And what do you know about pesticides and insects? They build up an immunity. Some of them make it, and those that make it produce, and you continue, on the cycle. Looking at people in here that have hair similar to mine, we know that we have seen how insects adapt. And so the mite has adapted. So we are trying to get a bee that's a good housekeeper that will come up and take that mite off that other neighbor bee and drop it outside the hive. We haven't quite figured out how to do that yet. The evolutionary process is helping us out, but bees don't, there's a cycle that takes place, but it's helping. So one of the things we look for in a queen that is going to have a generation of good housekeepers. Well, the other thing that happened with, we have all these great scientific tools is we were able to identify viruses that honeybees have. And then we found out about 5 years ago that the mites carry the viruses. So now what do you do for viruses? Same thing with humans. Be healthy. So then there was articles that came out in the bee journals. How do you have fat, healthy honeybees? Well, you had to feed them. And that's partly what they do to get the bees ready for the almonds. Because the almonds need bees February the 1st. That's when you get them over there to pollinate the almonds. Are bees ready February the 1st? No. They're still in semi-hibernation. And they don't hibernate like bumblebees do, but they aren't in mass population. So honeybee keepers trick them. We feed them. We do different kinds of things to increase that population so that when I bring my bees over to the almonds, they can pollinate them. The almond growers kind of got smart, too. They started asking us to open up the boxes so we could show them how many frames of bees are in your hive. And so you get paid now. If you have a 3-frame hive, you get one thing. If you have a 5-frame hive, you get another amount of money. And so it's kind of prorated that way. So again, we found out that with the mites, they carry these viruses. And what do? Basically, with my bees, I've watched them die, which is not, my bees for me are like my pets. And when I would see that they would have the deformed wing virus, there's nothing I could do except try to, have them be healthy hives, feed them. But basically, once they've gotten the virus, they will crash. Because the bees, with this particular virus, it's called the deformed wing virus, the bees have deformed wings, and you can see it. Well, they don't fly because they can't. And actually, when you see a bee that's flying in your backyard, it's a senior citizen, because the bees basically have 3 stages. They're in the larva stage, then we call them house bees, and then the last part of their life is when they're out foraging, and that's when they're going to your garden. So let me go to the garden, because the other question sometimes becomes, what can you do to help us out? Which is really helping yourself out, because look at the food that's on your plate and how much of it came from plants that were pollinated. And again, that's where we get back to pollinators, not just honeybees. So, but let me again make that connection. As we were looking at what's happening to honeybees, we were monitoring it. We don't monitor bumblebees. We don't monitor other pollinators. Now we're beginning to monitor the butterfly. Good, because we need to. Because you mentioned here the canary in the coal mine. Is the honeybee the canary in the coal mine? Possibly. It's another one. And so as we looked at this decline, I used to have 40 to 50 beehives. I used to get 500 pounds of honey a year. I sold it at 4 different outlets. Now I have 15 beehives. I don't sell my honey because I don't have any to sell. It's a different world. So somebody said, well, why don't you just buy new queens? I did. I bought 30 queens. I bought 10 Russians one year. I bought 10 bees from San Luis Obispo. I thought, well, maybe if I buy them locally, that might, they're already adapted to the climate and all that kind of stuff. Of those 30 queens, and they range from, most of them range around $15 a piece. None of them survived a summer. They all died off. Now, and my bees are not in the Salinas. Well, I live by Chular Bridge, so some of my bees are there, but I'm in the foothills. But otherwise, my bees are distributed through Monterey County, and I don't think they're really in areas where pesticides are applied. But that's another good question. You go to Home Depot, you buy plants there. Are they pre-treated with systemic pesticides? Well, last time I bought plants at Home Depot for my daughter's garden in Sacramento, the organics were on the outside. And I said, well, what about all those plants inside? And when I talked to the lady that was selling the organics, she said, I can't put my plants inside because I'm contracted with this space and that's where I can sell them. The other plants are inside. I said, well, what about those plants inside? Because when I buy a plant, I'd like to know if it's been pre-treated. She said, I can't comment about those plants inside. You'll have to ask the people inside. Well, I asked them and they don't know. They work there on an hourly rate and they just sell the plants. They don't know where they come from. They don't know anything else about them. But if you've done some things on the internet, you know that plants are pre-treated. Now, why would they want to do that? They don't want that plant to die, because if you bring in a plant back and it's died, they give you another one. So they're interested in keeping that plant alive. So what are they applying? Now, I'm not sure, Mark, if you had a bunch of categories up here. The neonicotinoids, is that in one of your categories? No, it's not. Okay. So for me, systemic pesticides, one of them is a neonicotinoid. It's a nicotine-based pesticide. It works great. But unfortunately, it works on my honeybees too. It's you can buy it at Home Depot. They sell it to kill your aphis on your roses. No restrictions. But again, they don't tell you if they pre-treated an orange tree that you may be buying. And from what I understand, I just read an article in the Science magazine 2014, November 2014, that to me, this is like the new DDT. And again, young people, DDT, they go, what are you talking about? So they didn't live through that cycle where the eggs didn't stay eggs. But this is what's being applied. And again, from what I understand, the neonicotinoids are banned in Europe, but they're not banned here. So yes, did they do a test? Yeah, they tested it and showed that it didn't kill bees. But the question then becomes, how do they test? Well, and this gets into a lot of the complicated research and how research is done. Partly how they do it is they apply it and this kind of stuff, and they want to know, did it kill the bee then? So this is kind of like that buffer zone thing, where what's the buffer zone that he talked about? Now, when they apply a pesticide, there's a life to that pesticide. And that, each day it goes down and down and down and finally disintegrates, hopefully, depending upon the pesticide. So the neonicotinoid, what the beekeepers are finding is we're concerned about what I think they call the synergistic approach to pesticides. So, you get this, what he showed you up here is each pesticide. Well, what happens when you put two together? Do they double? Do they work together? Or do they negate each other? And from what we're seeing, what we want as a beekeeper, we want studies that show, they've applied two pesticides and how they affect the bee. So let me go back to the pollinator. And there is an act, sometimes we get the federal government involved. Beekeepers were a bunch of independent, what I call SOBs, because they don't like government intervention. They want to do it their way, but when the bees started dying off, they used all their money to try to figure out what's going on. Finally, they ran out of money. So then they go to the government and they try to get some money. So now, because more and more pollinators are dying, the government now has an act called the Save the America's Pollinator Act. Of course, it's stuck in committee. You've heard that before. But anyway, that's one of the things that people are getting more concerned about is other pollinators. And the honeybee is just one of the pollinators, but we have learned that there's problems, like the canary in the coal mine, because we study honeybees. We're now studying the butterfly, but people don't study bumblebees or the wasp or some of the other native pollinators. One other thing you could do, what can you do again? Sunset Magazine's got usually an article in there about what you can do in your backyard to help beekeepers out. And that's to plant plants that bloom. Bees need a food supply. They need it all the time. And again, when we get into this monoculture of, acres and acres and acres of almonds, so what are they eating? Almond pollen. Now, if you just ate carrots all day long, it doesn't work too good. Okay, so we need a diversified diet. And the honeybee is the same way. They need a diversified diet so that they can survive. So if you can plant bees in plant plants that bees can pollinate, all year long. That's the other part. We have a nice spring, then it's a desert at my house. So thank you very much, and maybe you've got some questions.
Now we'll accept some questions, and if they can be questions in no longer than a minute, that'd be great. So, Cynthia.
About several months ago, we had a college professor, an ag professor from Hartnell talking, and he was talking about GMOs. And one of us asked this professor what his choice was in terms of pesticides or GMOs. He said he thought GMOs were so much safer that it solved some of the problems that the pesticides were purposed for in a much safer product. And I was wondering what Mark's comment would be to that.
I would have difficulty, not being a scientist, addressing the overall which might be better than the other. But I do know that because the GMO industry is so dominated by a few companies, just like the pesticide industry, 6 companies dominate 75% of the industry in pesticides. That with GMOs, sometimes they're the same companies that have the pesticides and the GMOs, so they make products or seeds that are resistant to pesticides. And then, of course, as Dale was explaining earlier, what happens is the new pests are stronger, and so they keep making. So the weird thing that's happened is we've seen more pesticide use with GMOs than less, where we might have expected otherwise. But because of this pattern, one of our concerns is GMOs has been increasing the applications of pesticides rather than reducing them. I'm concerned about both. But as far as, I suppose I could imagine a GMO plant that is beneficial. It's harder to imagine something with some of these chemicals we had up here being safe. I mean, there's sides, right? CIDES, that's killing it. It's killing something, and you usually don't get good stuff out of that. So that's how you do the balance.
Question over here.
Comment on the GMO. There's a film called Genetic Roulette, and it's about GMOs all across America, and it's apparently causing animal sterility and even human or fertility clinics across America because there's something like a black mold getting inserted and it's causing infertility. That's one comment. The comment I wanted to make about the bees. This is 6-year-old information coming out of Auburn, California from a bee scientist. They said they used powdered sugar. Now, I don't know if they put the powdered sugar on the beehive or if the bees ate the powdered sugar, but it caused the mites to lose their suction cups so it fell off.
One of the treatments for the mites, because I mentioned, they have these little suction cups, is to take powdered sugar and we sprinkle it on the frames inside the hive, and the mites then crawl around, get powdered sugar on the suction cups. They can't stay stuck on the bee, so then they drop down. So to the bottom of the box. And so actually then used to have a solid bottom board. Now some people use screen bottom boards so that when the mite drops, it drops down and falls through the screen onto the ground and then doesn't get back up into the hive. It's again a very labor intensive treatment, but the problem with this is that where does the mite lay its eggs? On the larva, inside the cell, and it then attaches itself to the larva, sucks juices out of the larva. The powdered sugar never gets there because it's inside the cell, and then it hatches on that larva. So what we've had to try to do is apply the powdered sugar during the winter time when they're not, the queen's not laying eggs, and also the mites like the drone cell. That's the one that lives the longest. It has a longer incubation period. And so it stays in that one.
Becker?
2 questions. One, as far as GMOs, it's a good website to follow is GM Watch, and it kind of explains how GMOs are related to an increased use in fertilizer and pesticide. As you said, they're all by the same company, so they have a vested interest in increasing the use of the fertilizer and pesticide. But what I really want to know is, what does the European Union do? How are they not using these toxic pesticides?
They're still using pesticides, but not pesticides that reach the level of dangers that because they have a standard of prove that it's safe before we use it, rather than what we have here, which is, well, prove to me it's dangerous, and then we'll stop.
Have a precautionary principle.
Yeah, it's closer to a precautionary principle, exactly. And so, again, I'm not as studied in this as I should be, but they have a number of different, and I do have materials that I can get to you about that, but I'm not fluent with all the alternatives that have been developed.
Bev, with our Monterey County Ag Commissioner and his 500-foot buffer zones, one would assume that enforcement may be a problem, and specifically you sounded very confident that methyl bromide is going to be gone. And my question to you is, will it be gone because the manufacturers will be forced to stop distributing it, or will it be gone, will it be depending on the Ag Commissioner to enforce these kinds of regulations? One of the things that concerns me is if they can't distribute it in the United States, they'll just take it and start pushing it in other countries.
Oh, yes.
So
that's what they'll probably do with the leftover stockpile. Yeah. I would guess. But they're not supposed to, I mean, they aren't supposed to use it. Look, there may be some politics that ends up to more extended period for emergency use. I hope that doesn't happen, but it's a very big lobby, and I guess I don't have the answers to your questions.
Darby, and please ask a question.
Okay. Mark, you were under the state air monitoring studies. You mentioned that the teachers were making demands. Who listens?
So the Santa Cruz Ag Commissioner apparently does notify the Pajaro Valley Unified School District administration when they receive information about applications near the schools. And they also claim that they monitor every single one of them that's done as close to the school as you can get.
That's
Santa Cruz. That is not the case in Monterey County. We can't get a straight answer out of Monterey County yet, and we hope to through political pressure. Yeah.
Dennis.
Question of clarification. What's the purpose of the 72-hour notice? Like, you get to call in sick or something?
Yeah, maybe. So, part of the problem is the mystery that teachers, parents, children who are aware go through regarding, I showed that photograph for a reason. The teacher showed up that day, it was 7:30, schools are getting off in Boston, and she sees this spraying that's going on in the field right next to the school. And it's hard to develop a policy which would be the natural, which would naturally follow out of the information without having the information about what's being sprayed when it is, in places, and I know, Jen, you worked in Ventura regarding air pollution. I went to a high school that was east of Los Angeles with really heavy smog, and we had a protocol for what happened at the school during certain levels of smog. Like there was a low level, a medium level, and a really high level, and we could adjust what the children would do regarding the smog level based on the information that they get. So maybe, and again, this is what teachers are thinking about right now. If they had the information about when the fumigants would be sprayed, especially these three that we're talking about, then they might be able to develop a system of notifying parents, a system of whether there are students with more concerns about their breathing, whether if it's T-loan, whether they should close the school, shorten the day, something like that. without the information, you can't it's hard to make a protocol. So I think that's what we want. We want to be able to make informed decisions, and right now we can't.
There's a lot of air pollution monitoring stations in California, and they measure air pollution, including ozone. Why don't they use those for measuring pesticides as well?
I'm a retired member of the Monterey Bay Unified Air Pollution Control District, and air districts are responsible for monitoring criteria pollutants, primarily, which are not toxic air contaminants. They're carbon monoxide, ozone levels, particulates. So it's not within the regulatory framework, nor do they necessarily have the equipment to do that. But in listening to the presentation, it occurred to me that several of these pesticides are toxic air contaminants, and those clearly fall under the jurisdiction of an air district. So it might be worthwhile to approach the air district to see if there is a possibility of monitoring toxic air contaminants, or those pesticides that are toxic air contaminants. And I don't know if that has been addressed or not. And I'd also like to address the issue related to cancer risk. That's a very complex kind of calculation, and cancer risk is calculated assuming a 70-year exposure. So that is why the data are averaged over a period of time, because it's based on 70-year exposure and a very complex set of calculations. Exposure, chronic exposure, or one-time acute exposure to pesticide is not going to create a cancer risk, but exposure over a long period of time will. So, any other questions? Beth,
I
again?
just wanted to put in a plug for organic agriculture and integrated pest management. I think that questions like, what does the European Union do? There's far more integrated pest management there. And to say that it is not essential to have the cheapest strawberries produced by chemicals, that organic strawberries are economically viable, I think they've shown in studies, and it's just the resistance of companies that are used to using pesticides and don't want to change to other things that prevents it. The least we can do is buy organic strawberries.
Carol.
Yeah, I have a similar concern, and that is that our current practices in this county of year-round strawberries is a very new phenomenon, and one of the reasons that they do that is that they can use these pesticides year-round. They can fumigate year-round and prepare the soil, which is killing soil organisms. It's not feeding the strawberries, it's simply killing the soil organisms that would destroy the young strawberry plants. But this is not a singular thing. They use the fumigant, then on the plants they use other kinds of fertilizers perhaps, most of which are manufactured and not from the compost pile, year-round. So there's multiple chemicals at all times that are affecting the food production, and certainly the people who are standing next to it or nearby. You noticed in Mark's photo, there was no posting on that school fence of what was being sprayed.
Right.
The law says there has to be. It wasn't there, but the teacher's not going to be reporters of that.
Let me make a comment about, from a honeybee perspective again, honeybee keepers are supposed to be notified when spraying is going to occur if my honeybees are located within so many feet or whatever of an pesticide application. Well, here again, it becomes, does the county have the secretarial staff that's going to give me a phone call? Do they have code enforcement that is going to go out and monitor to see that those signs are up that says you're not supposed to go into the field? So there are some other limitations that take place. But then again, without the data that you're talking about, we know how many pounds. I mean, you can go to the ag department and find out how many pounds of something has been applied. But air quality, what's happening to that chemical as it gets out there. That's another question.
Jim, and this will be the last question.
What an honor. I'd like to know what happens if we have a continual decline in bee population. I've seen figures about how many billions of dollars bees contribute to agricultural production. Does that money just go away, or do we have alternatives?
Not to be sarcastic again, but we go on a big diet. Because, I don't know, Einstein made a quote about what happens when the bee population decreases. We're going to decrease. Our human population is going to decrease because our food supply is going to decrease. Now, yes, there are a bunch of other pollinators out there, and if you ever watched a bumblebee, man, they do a great job. You see bumblebees, keep them in your yard. They're great pollinators, they're native pollinators. But again, it's going to, there are pictures you can go on the internet and see a grocery store with bee pollination, and then a grocery store without bee pollination, and the produce section is almost empty. Pollination has its benefits also just from the plant. If you see a watermelon that hasn't been pollinated, it's stunted in growth. It doesn't form, properly. So we need these pollinators, and to get too scary here. I get depressed, unfortunately, because I don't have the beehives that I used to have. And I've done everything that I know of in the book to not use pesticides to kill the mites and that kind of stuff. So I'm down to 15 hives. And now I watch and see how many of my hives are going to make it through the winter. And then I try to use those bees and those queens, make new queens from those ones that have survived.
I want to thank both of our guests today. It has been an informative presentation. Next month we will have another uplifting program. Thank you.
Thanks.